Right now, in your pocket or your bag, there is a piece of paper, or maybe just a number on a screen, and you have probably never stopped to ask the question that should terrify you: why is it worth anything at all? Not in a philosophical sense, in a very real, very practical sense. The coffee you bought this morning, the rent you paid last week, the salary deposited into your account, all of it depends on a system most people never see, never study, and never question. A system that decides every single second of every single day what your money is actually worth. And here is the strange part. Nobody elected the people running it. Nobody voted on the rules. Most of the world does not even know it exists. You are about to find out exactly how it works. To understand the invisible system, you have to go back to a hotel in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944. The world was still at war, but the men gathering at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods were already planning for what came after. 700 delegates from 44 nations, and they had one enormous problem to solve. How do you rebuild global trade when every country has its own currency, its own rules, and its own economic wounds? The answer they landed on changed everything. The Bretton Woods Agreement created the first true international monetary system. And at the center of it was a simple but radical idea. Every currency in the world would be pegged to the US dollar. And the US dollar would be backed by gold. 1 ounce of gold equaled $35. Fixed. Guaranteed. The United States Federal Reserve promised that anyone holding dollars could exchange them for gold at that rate, any time. For a while, it worked. Global trade expanded. Economies rebuilt. The dollar became the language of international business. But there was a flaw buried inside the design. A fatal one. The economist Robert Triffin saw it first. In 1960, he testified before the United States Congress and described what is now called the Triffin dilemma. If the dollar was the world's reserve currency, the US had to supply the world with dollars. That meant running trade deficits, sending more dollars out than came back in, but if you kept sending dollars out, eventually the world would hold far more dollars than the US had gold to back them. And when that moment came, the promise would break. Triffin was ignored. For a decade. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon walked into the Oval Office and made a 10-minute television address that shook the global financial system to its foundation. He called it a temporary suspension. He said it was to protect the dollar from international speculators. What he actually did was end the gold standard permanently. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by nothing physical at all. Economists called this the Nixon Shock. Some predicted immediate catastrophe, hyperinflation, currency collapse, the end of American financial dominance. None of that happened. And understanding why is where the real story begins. When the dollar lost its gold backing, it did not lose its value. Because value, it turns out, does not come from gold. It never really did. It comes from something far more abstract, far more powerful, and far more fragile. It comes from trust. But trust alone is not a system. Trust needs architecture, and that architecture already existed. It had been quietly built over decades, hiding in plain sight. It is called the Petrodollar system. In 1974, just 3 years after the Nixon Shock, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia. The details were classified for decades, but the structure was straightforward. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection and weapons to the Saudi regime. Within a few years, every major OPEC nation had agreed to the same arrangement. Oil, the single commodity that every economy on Earth needs to function, could only be purchased in dollars. Think about what that means. If you are Japan and you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you first need to acquire US dollars. If you are Germany and you want to keep your factories running, you need a reserve of US dollars. If you are Brazil, Indonesia, South Korea, or any nation that imports energy, you are permanently, structurally dependent on the US dollar. The dollar did not need gold anymore. It had something better. It had oil. This is the invisible system. Not a conspiracy. Not a secret cabal. Just an elegant piece of economic architecture that most people never think about, because it hides inside the prices of everything they buy. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. The petrodollar system means the United States can do something no other country on earth can do. It can print money to pay its debts, and the world will absorb those dollars because the world needs them to buy energy. The economist Barry Eichengreen called this America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow cheaply, spend freely, and export inflation to the rest of the world. When the Federal Reserve prints dollars, prices do not only rise in America, they ripple outward. The cost of oil goes up everywhere it is priced in dollars. Importing nations pay more, their currencies weaken, their central banks scramble to maintain dollar reserves. The effect of American monetary policy spreads across every economy on Earth, whether those economies agreed to it or not. The former French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it an exorbitant privilege in 1965, before the petrodollar even fully formed. He could already see what was coming, that America would hold a structural advantage over every other economy simply because it controlled the world's reserve currency. And now the question you are probably already asking: what happens when that changes? Because it is already changing. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. China has been signing bilateral trade agreements to price oil in yuan. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their growing list of partners have publicly discussed building an alternative reserve currency. Saudi Arabia has held talks with China about pricing oil in currencies other than the dollar. Russia, cut off from the dollar system by sanctions after 2022, has accelerated deals to trade in local currencies with India, China, and others. This is not a sudden rupture. Reserve currency transitions take decades. The British pound dominated global trade for over a century before the dollar replaced it after World War II. The transition was gradual, then all at once. What economists debate now is not whether the dollar's dominance will end. It is when, and what replaces it. Some point to a multipolar currency world, where the dollar, the euro, and the yuan each hold regional dominance. Others argue that digital currencies, central bank digital currencies issued by governments, could eventually bypass the dollar system entirely. A few economists, like Michael Hudson, argue that the petrodollar system was always a form of financial imperialism, and its decline is simply the rest of the world reclaiming monetary sovereignty. None of these futures are certain. All of them are already beginning. And here is what this means for you, sitting wherever you are right now, looking at the numbers in your bank account. The value of your money is not a fixed fact. It is not determined by what you earned or what you saved or how carefully you managed your finances. It is determined by a system built in 1944, reinforced in 1974, maintained by geopolitical relationships you were never consulted on, and currently being renegotiated by nations whose decisions will ripple through your grocery bill, your mortgage rate, and your retirement savings before you ever hear about them on the news. That piece of paper in your pocket, that number on your screen, it is worth exactly what the invisible system says it is worth. No more, no less. And right now, for the first time in 80 years, the people running that system are not entirely sure what comes next.